I joined Jacob Martin's channel to discuss the entire Pink Panther series starring Peter Sellers all the way through Steve Martin's renditions, and to keep the franchise energy strong, I decided it'd be kind of cool to have him come over to my channel to discuss a different franchise, that of the Mummy series, ranging from the trilogy with Brendan Fraser, as well as the highly ignored and failed Tom Cruise remake. These movies, specifically the Fraser films, I remember really enjoying, but I've only seen them all once. I actually saw the Tom Cruise movie twice, and thus I remember that one the most. But strap in, and let's talk about this 1999 version of The Mummy. So The Mummy centers on a treasure hunter by the name of Rick O'Connell, played by Brendan Fraser, who is asked to aid on the search for the lost and hidden Egyptian city, where it's said to hold countless golden artifacts. Though, on this quest, they find a Book of the Dead, which when read aloud, awakens a terrifying and indestructible mummy named Imhotep that brings with him all the plagues of Egypt. But how does one stop an unstoppable monster? So first of all, big thanks to Jacob for joining me today. We'll be hearing his thoughts on The Mummy in just a hot second! First, I'll go ahead and give my positives for this instant classic. The Mummy is made, as Jacob's going to talk about as well, very similarly to a lot of the greatest adventure stories of all time, Indiana Jones being a prime example, and I agree 110%. This movie does not immediately feel like it was shot and made and edited in the late 90s. It feels much more classic than that, except for anytime CGI is used. I'll talk about that in a little bit. Now, a lot of the music utilized by Jerry Goldsmith is incredible. It really helps the film feel as adventurous and exciting as it does. The balance between horror, action, and adventure is probably the best done in this film versus any of the others, but I do need to rewatch those to make sure. Brendan Fraser as Rick O'Connell is amazing. This is probably Brendan's best role, though I do love most of what he's done in his career. This is probably the most iconic, though. His character, rewatching this movie, I felt was probably the closest match to Nathan Drake from the Uncharted video game series that I think I've ever seen. His charm, his attitude, his sarcasm, wit, and snappy comebacks, even what he wears, it was all clearly something that inspired that game. I just thought that that was really interesting because I am a big fan of that video game series. The plot itself about a mummy coming back from the dead, mummifying others as he goes about the land, becoming more and more powerful as he goes, is very original to me. And even though I remembered that plot based off of the remake, which is something that essentially does the same exact thing, this felt more tense, more authentic, more classic, all because of how many moving parts exist in this film that were done with precision and grace. If I remember it correctly, Tom Cruise's remake failed for a variety of reasons, one of them being because it just felt so produced and unauthentic and forced, while this felt so natural and created with love for each genre. The horror is scary, the action is thrilling, the adventure is grand and exciting. Everything fits as it should. In general, there's so many reasons why anybody watching this movie would fall in love with it. But before I go into some of my negatives, let's hear a word of what Jacob has to say about The Mummy. Take it away, man.
What's going on, Dave and all his viewers? Thank you, Dave, for having me be a part of your channel once again. And I guess you're returning the favor because I just had you on my channel where I covered all of the Pink Panther movies. Now you're inviting me to come on your channel to talk about the Mummy movies, starting with The Mummy, released in 1999. This, of course, being a remake of the 1932 film The Mummy, starring Boris Karloff. That is a classic monster movie. Not one of my personal favorites, but it's okay for what it is. And there's a whole franchise of those films. I guess I'm thankful, Dave, you didn't ask me to cover those because I covered all of the old school Mummy films on my channel. And aside from the first film, the rest of the movies are boring, interchangeable. They repeat the same plot, and they are so forgettable. I didn't really want to rewatch those again. So, The Mummy. This was actually my introduction to the lore of The Mummy. This 1999 film starring Brendan Fraser. This film was directed by Stephen Sommers, who is really good at crafting these like over-the-top, big-budget spectacle action films. He also directed the 1994 version of The Jungle Book, which is criminally underrated in today's standards. And he also directed G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra, which is an absolute guilty pleasure. As stupid of a movie as that is, I love the absolute stupidity of that movie. The Mummy, I would argue, is a great movie and is a better movie than you remember. I think this movie is really clever in how it reimagines the story of the Mummy. It covers the same story that the original film had, whereas the original film relied more on atmosphere and horror to tell its story. This is more of an action-adventure film in vein of the Indiana Jones movies. It has more of an Indiana Jones type tone to the film compared to the old school horror monster elements. But the horror elements are blended in with the action-adventure stuff that makes it a very unique blend of tone and genre. There are dark layers within the story, whether the backstory behind the mummy and how the character Imhotep got to be an undead mummy, which is pretty brutal stuff when you look at the prologue of the film. And there are some really terrifying sequences sprinkled throughout the course of the movie, such as the mummy taking out characters that were cursed when they open these sacred forbidden jars, and he rips out people's eyes and tongues and like mummifies them and while he gets their organs and fluids to become a humanized version of what he once was. That is pretty brutal stuff. And then when he comes back from the dead, he ends up unleashing the 10 plagues of Egypt. So we get a lot of biblical imagery present throughout this movie. And some of those sequences were very well visualized even 20 years after its original release. You got all those things, but then you got the flip side of the coin with Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, who team up together and they go on this adventure to find this lost city, and they're the ones who end up unknowingly wreaking havoc and awakening this undead mummy. That's when the horror sequences come in, and they're the ones that have to undo what they unintentionally started. So it's a very fun movie. There's a lot of cool action set pieces in this movie. There's a lot of CGI in this movie, and I'll admit this came out in 1999. The CGI hasn't held up the best. Some CGI shots look pretty dated in today's standards, especially these extended shots of like CGI creepy crawly bugs going around. They haven't aged the best. And then some of the stages of the mummy when he comes back look a little on the uncanny valley side in today's standards. But what I respect about this movie visually is that, yeah, while there's CGI in this movie and some of it hasn't aged the best, I love that the movie uses real locations and practical stunts for as much of the movie as possible, and they only use CGI when they have to. And I think that makes for a more visual spectacle of a movie where you have mostly real stuff on camera and then only employ the CGI when they need to. And I think that makes the movie more timeless in that regard. And I really enjoyed the visual style of this movie overall. I think this movie is very well directed. You got a great cast on the way. Brendan Fraser, one of my favorite action heroes, honestly, is Rick O'Connell, because there's a little bit of Indiana Jones. He's very smug like Han Solo, but he's also his own character as well. And I love what Brendan Fraser brought to the role. I love the chemistry he shares with Rachel Weisz. Arnold Vosloo plays Imhotep the Mummy. I think Boris Karloff is more iconic, I guess, but man, he played the role very well too, and is very intense to watch at times. I love the score of this movie. The score is done by Jerry Goldsmith, one of the great classic composers of all time, and it's a really underrated action-adventure score that's highly memorable every time that I revisit it. This is a movie that I have been a fan of for many, many years. It's one of my favorite action-adventure films outside of the Indiana Jones franchise. It's not as iconic, I guess, and the Indiana Jones films, I think, are overall better made, and they're more timeless. This definitely feels more like a product of its era, I guess, but I still love it for what it is. It's one of my favorite non-Indiana Jones action-adventure films. I love the characters. The action and adventure in this movie is great. And the horror element sprinkled in it is that extra icing on the cake that makes the movie so much fun to watch. Thank you, Dave, for asking me to revisit this franchise again. This is my favorite of the Mummy films. As much as I respect elements of the 1932 film with Boris Karloff, this movie is a lot more memorable in my opinion, and this, in my opinion, is the definitive Mummy film, and it's a blast to watch every time I revisit it. I'll be giving The Mummy a 4.5 out of 5 stars, and on my 100-point scale, it's getting an 87 out of 100. So once again, thank you, Dave, for inviting me on your channel, and I can't wait to be a part of this collab series with you talking about the Mummy franchise. I think The Mummy Returns is next, the sequel to this film with Brendan Fraser reprising his role. It's been a while since I've seen some of the Mummy sequels, so we'll see how these sequels go. I'm excited to be a part of this journey with you. I'm sure Dave will leave links in the description below where you can check out my YouTube channel where I do movie reviews, TV reviews, vlog videos, ranking videos, and other fun stuff along the way. I guess that's all for me on this video, so Dave, back to you.
Thank you to Jacob for joining me in today's review. I definitely appreciate everything you had to say here, which basically I agree with 110%. I have not seen the classic black and white Boris Karloff. Why do I say Karloff? I have never seen the classic black and white Boris Karloff films, nor do I really plan on seeing them anytime soon, but I enjoyed hearing what you had to say about those, as well as your general thoughts about this movie, which is very much a great, memorable film that Brendan Fraser knocks it out of the park with. Though I will talk about some negatives now. So, like I said before, and as Jacob also mentioned, its biggest downfall is clearly the CGI. In the late 90s, we haven't really quite figured out how to implement CGI to its fullest extent. Technology just was not there yet. And so I feel like they pushed that envelope here and there in parts of the movie that just weren't ready for it. The CGI is just immediately recognizable as fake. Fake mummified remains, fake bugs, fake sandstorm, whatever. Now Jacob, he also mentioned the practical effects. When used, he's right. The practical effects, the real stuff, that looks amazing. It really does. They definitely use stuff like that to their full advantage whenever possible. And they use CGI stuff whenever they couldn't fake it with practical effects. I get it, and I definitely commend them for not going crazy with the CGI stuff whenever it was unnecessary. But that still doesn't really change the fact that anytime CGI is used, it's just not great. And in 2022, it's not up to par. It's not. But hopefully, that won't really sway your experience as a whole. The only other negative that I have for this film is only a very slight technical complaint, and that's the utilization of the characters and how important they are. We don't have a lot of diversity here. We have fake diversity, if you will. Meaning, for instance, the character played by Rachel Weisz, she's explained to be necessary because she can read hieroglyphics and has ancient Egyptian heritage in her blood. But, if you really pay attention, her character is mostly just kind of a love interest for Brendan Fraser and Imhotep. That's not really that great in terms of individual importance of her character. Likewise, Benny, for instance, exactly the same thing. He's comedic relief, but otherwise not really that important. The people that also travel with them to this location, a lot of them are kind of pointless. They're there for Imhotep and the other mummies to basically attack and kill and for crazy things to happen to them. And it's crazy, but again, you don't care about their characters, nor do you really know their names. They're just, victims, essentially. The only real important person at the end of the day is Brendan Fraser and Imhotep. With that being said, let's break down my final score from a technical, unbiased perspective. It's a mixture of really well done stuff and maybe some aged stuff like CGI. Thankfully, the CGI doesn't overpower the rest of the technical aspects that the film makes, such as cinematography, which is fantastic, practical effects, music, dialogue, concept, originality, all that. It's still a very well-made action-adventure film with a love for horror as well. So this score is 84%. When it comes down to how I just personally felt about the film or my bias score, that's obviously higher because this is a movie that is made to be fun. I mean, they created an amusement park ride about this movie, which, by the way, is really cool. They used tiny tubes of air pressure to simulate thousands of bugs crawling up your legs. It's amazing and sure to give people nightmares. But yeah, this movie is so good, so fun, so nostalgic that my bias score is hanging out at 98%, meaning that when we combine those two scores together, we come to the final rating of 91%. 91 out of 100 possible stars, which is not that far off from Jacob's own score, so take that as you will. I just think it's well worth a watch, even 23 years after the fact. Anyways, thanks once again to Jacob for joining me. You can check out his YouTube channel. I've left a link to that in my description box down below, as well as a link to his second channel, Storytime with Jacob, where he reads and reviews a selection of books. Give him some love, tell him I sent you. And as for YouTube, you guys know what to do. Hit that like, subscribe button, and bell to be notified when I come out with my next review. And until then, peace out!